It was July 1942. The captain gave the order to fire. Compressed air hissed, and USS Grunion spat a Mark 14 into the black water off the Aleutians. The crew listened as it dropped into the depths, propellers biting, wake fading into the dark. Somewhere ahead, a Japanese convoy crept through the fog, unaware. In the control room, men counted the seconds to impact. 30, 40. The captain's hand hovered over the chart, waiting for the tremor of a hit. Nothing. No echoes through the hull. No plume. Just the hiss of air and the scrape of boots on steel. He ordered another shot. Then came the hiss, the splash, and the weight. Somewhere in that silence, the Navy's newest torpedo, fast, noiseless, and believed to be flawless, was already hunting the wrong ship. During World War I, the U.S. Navy had an effective torpedo in the form of the Mark 10, but after the war, the torpedo struggled to keep pace with advances in naval design. The Mark 10, introduced in 1915, carried nearly a quarter ton of TNT, driven by a white heater steam turbine and guided by a mechanical gyro with hydrostatic pendulum depth control. Its Mark III contact exploder was simple and effective. In its prime, a single hit was often enough to send a ship to the bottom of the ocean. However, Japanese destroyers like the Fubuki class, commissioned in 1928, could reach speeds exceeding 36 knots, which was faster than the Mark 10's top velocity. A quick turn and a few thousand yards of sprinting could allow a ship to evade an attack entirely. Meanwhile, capital ships were being retrofitted with anti-torpedo bulges and improved internal compartments, reducing the effect of side impact detonations. As such, work on designing a successor began in 1931. Named the Mark 14, it kept the Mark 10's 21-inch width to fit existing tubes, but stretched the body to hold more fuel, a stronger engine, and even an extra man's weight of explosives. Inspired by World War I wreckage and German magnetic mine work from the 1920s, it embraced the idea of exploding beneath the keel, where armor was weakest, and inflicting catastrophic structural damage. The device was hailed as revolutionary. It was everything the Navy wanted. Faster, farther shooting, and armed with a larger warhead that could cripple or sink even the heaviest vessels. Confidence was so complete that live fire trials with real warheads were skipped. Paper tests and controlled range experiments were deemed enough. On the eve of war, the Mark 14 promised to become the perfect weapon. Yet even before it reached the front, it had to survive the bottlenecks of American industry. A torpedo was not a shell that could be stamped out by the thousands. It was a miniature submarine in its own right, self-propelled, finely balanced, and crammed with delicate sensors and clockwork-like controls. Each demanded hand-fitting by skilled workers and weeks of careful assembly before it was ready for service. Factories could only produce them in small numbers. Determined to ensure a steady wartime supply, the Navy poured millions into expanding its torpedo factories. New plants were built to supply the swelling ranks of Clemson-class destroyers and Omaha-class cruisers. Yet once the Washington Naval Treaty took effect, the Navy's demand for torpedoes collapsed. Intended to prevent an arms race, it imposed strict limits on capital ships and total tonnage. Entire classes of battleships and cruisers were cancelled on the slipways or sent straight to the scrapyard. With hulls vanishing, the demand for torpedoes evaporated too. What had looked like a coming era of mass production collapsed into peacetime austerity. The Navy dismantled much of the infrastructure it had just built. During the 1930s, one facility remained, the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island. It held a monopoly over design, testing, and production. With no rival firms to verify its work, Newport judged its own products. Every report claimed success, whether for the Mark 14 or the new magnetic exploder, and the Navy, eager for good news, took those claims at face value. Funding was tight, orders were small, and production moved at a crawl. As the fleet expanded, Newport was inundated with requests for every type of torpedo, including those for submarines, destroyers, aircraft, and even smaller models for PT boats. Backlogs grew into the hundreds and then the thousands. By 1937, despite 3 shifts and a workforce of 3,000, the factory managed only about 1.5 torpedoes a day. After political wrangling, the long-closed Alexandria Torpedo Station was revived, and together, the two plants managed 3 torpedoes a day, against a Navy requirement of 50. The Bureau of Ordnance cast its net wider, handing contracts to unlikely firms, including Pontiac, the American Can Company, and even makers of farm equipment. Production improved, but never matched demand. The result was predictable. America entered the war not only with a defective torpedo, but with far too few of them in hand. That shortage would prove costly almost immediately. When hostilities against the United States opened on December 7, 1941, Japanese bombers not only disabled battleships, but also touched off a chain of secondary explosions when they struck the Naval Ammunition Depot at West Loch. Among the wreckage lay more than 200 of the Navy's newly issued Mark 14 torpedoes, stockpiled for operations yet to come. At the time, the entire pre-war inventory of Mark 14s numbered around 2,000, divided between Pearl Harbor, Cavite in the Philippines, and stateside depots. That meant nearly 10% of the Navy's total torpedo supply was wiped out in a single strike. Worse, they'd gone before a single American submarine had even fired its first shot. Shortages or not, submarines still sortied from Cavite and Pearl within days, crammed with as many Mark 14s as they could carry. With those few weapons, they were expected to halt, or at least slow, the Japanese advance on the Philippines. Unknowingly, in those first weeks of combat, they were giving the Mark 14 its first real trial by fire. One of the first boats to test it was USS Seawolf, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder. On December 14, 1941, she prowled the waters off Davao, stalking a Japanese convoy. With no radar, the hunt depended entirely on sound bearings and Warder's instincts. At dawn, the periscope broke the surface. In the gray half-light, Warder fixed his eyes on the target, a heavy freighter, low in the water, its deck stacked with cargo. The command to fire rang out throughout the entire hull. The first torpedo shot away, leaving a frothing track, seconds stretched into eternity. The crew waited for the telltale flash and rumble of impact. Nothing came. There was no explosion, no plume of water, just silence. A second shot followed. Again silence. To the men watching through the scope, it felt like throwing their most brutal punch and watching it land without effect. The convoy reacted at once. Japanese escorts sheared out of formation and bore down on Seawolf. Inside its sound room, the beat of the enemy propellers grew steadily louder until the vibration seemed to run through the entire hull. Warder ordered her deeper, pushing the boat below test depth. Seawolf twisted and turned through the black water, every man and everything silent, except for the creak of hull plates and the rush of ballast. Above them, the destroyers circled and dropped their depth charges again and again, an unending pounding that seemed to last forever. Only hours later, when the pattern thinned and the hunters finally moved on, did the crew allow themselves to breathe. Still, the frustration lingered. They had risked everything for nothing. Days later, Warder sighted another target, a 5,000-ton transport plowing through the sea under escort. Seawolf crept into position. A new batch of Mark 14s leapt from their tubes and surged toward the target. The crew braced, waiting for the thunder of impact. Again, nothing. Either they ran beneath the hull or struck without detonating. When Seawolf returned to Cavite, Warder's report spoke bluntly of duds and failures. On December 24th, Commander Tyrell D. Jacobs in Sargo also reached his breaking point. The war was less than 3 weeks old, and he'd finally maneuvered into the perfect position on 2 Japanese freighters off the Philippines. 8 torpedoes were deployed in carefully prepared spreads, every calculation double-checked, every angle accounted for. Not one detonated. The ship sailed on as if nothing had happened. To Jacobs, it was as though the ocean itself had swallowed his Mark 14s. He refused to believe the fault lay with his crew. When 2 more merchantmen appeared on the horizon, Jacobs pursued them for nearly an hour, adjusting his attack run until every number on the TDC lined up perfectly. At 1,000 yards, point blank by submarine standards, he fired again. 4 more torpedoes surged from their tubes. Again, silence. Days later, convinced something was wrong, Jacob studied the wakes more closely. He realized the Mark 14s were running far deeper than the settings indicated. He ordered adjustments, hoping a field fix might restore their bite. Soon after, Sargo came across a fat tanker crawling through the sea. Jacob set up with painstaking care and fired at just 1,200 yards. The torpedo hissed away and missed entirely. Exasperation overcame discipline. Jacobs did the unthinkable and broke radio silence in the middle of an operation to report his doubts about the Mark 14's reliability. If headquarters wanted to blame his crew, so be it. The evidence was there in the water. Their wonder weapon was failing. Aboard Sea Dragon, Commander Pete Farrell faced the same bitter lesson. 8 torpedoes fired in successive attacks produced only a single hit, and even that one failed to sink its target. Farrell returned to base shaken. He knew his crew had done everything right, and the only explanation left was that the torpedo itself was betraying them. Their reports were met with skepticism and dismissal from the Bureau of Ordnance, which remained steadfast in its belief that the Mark 14 was flawless. Missed targets were attributed to poor tactics, sloppy drills, and unfavorable angles. Any captain who doubted the Mark 14 was told to sharpen his aim. As for testing the weapon in real trials, that was out of the question. Torpedoes were already being used up in combat, faster than industry could build new ones. To tinker with the weapon was to invite trouble. Officials who attempted to do so were threatened with disciplinary action. However, the evidence continued to pile up. Captains from every corner of the Pacific were sending back the same reports. USS Tautog watched her torpedoes run clean under a target and fail to explode. Pollock fired a spread into a transport, only to see nothing detonate. Perch and Salmon reported one failed shot after another, even when their firing solutions were solid. By the summer of 1942, the complaints could no longer be dismissed. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, newly in command of U.S. submarine forces in Australia, was convinced the problem lay with the weapon. His boats had already expended more than a year's worth of torpedoes in just 6 months, with pitiful results to show for it. There had been hundreds of attacks, dozens of perfect firing solutions, yet Japanese ships sailed home untouched every single time. Lockwood decided that if Washington refused to test, he would do so himself. At Frenchman Bay near Albany, he ordered Jimco's skipjack to fire a practice shot against a torpedo net. The torpedo with an exercise head was set for 10 feet and sent toward the net. The mesh at 10 feet came up clean. At 15, still nothing. 20, still nothing. At 25 feet, there was the hole. The next day, James Fife Jr., formerly Chief of Staff to Lockwood's predecessor, ran 2 more test shots. Both confirmed the same result. The Mark 14s were running an average of 11 feet deeper than their settings. The Bureau of Ordnance was furious that its orders had been ignored. Yet word of the tests reached Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations, and he turned his fury on the Bureau instead. The fact that destroyers Mark 15s, the surface launch counterpart of the submarines Mark 14, were failing in the same way only tightened the noose. The Admiralty's tune changed only after the pressure became impossible to ignore. Repeated letters and personal visits from King finally elicited an admission from the Bureau of Ordnance. A few weeks later, they owned up to something worse. The torpedo's depth control system had not been properly validated under real operating conditions. Before the war, most tests were done with dummy warheads, so the torpedoes could be recovered. These test heads were significantly lighter than the actual ones. With less weight in the nose, the torpedoes held their depth more easily. Once the heavy explosive warhead was fitted, the balance changed, and the weapon drove deeper than intended. To make matters worse, the Mark 14's warhead had been made heavier than the early design. Those extra pounds pulled the nose down even further, and the tests that were supposed to track depth weren't reliable. Both the shore rigs and the torpedo's own recorders had built-in errors, showing the weapon running at the right depth, when in reality it was several feet deeper. Then there was the placement of the depth sensor itself. Instead of a mid-body port in relatively steady flow, the Mark 14's hydrostatic port sat on the cone of the tail near the propeller. When the torpedo was moving at speed, the water flow around its tail created a low-pressure pocket. The depth sensor, mounted there, picked this up as if the torpedo were shallower than it really was. In a still water tank, the readings looked fine. During an actual run, the sensor gave false data, and the torpedo drove itself deeper than the crew had set. This flaw only became apparent at high speeds. The flaw was at least manageable. Skippers learned to set their depth dials almost to zero, so the torpedoes would run where they should, and engineers shifted the depth sensor forward to the midsection on later production runs. By mid-1942, the quick fixes worked well enough. The Mark 14 was finally striking at the right depth. Unfortunately, that only uncovered a worse problem. More and more torpedoes were slamming into enemy hulls without detonating, or else blowing up far too early. Japanese ships kept moving, while most of the sinkings in the theater came from Dutch boats, with the occasional British patrol adding to the tally. In the early months of the war, American submarines launched around 97 Mark 14s, and only 3 enemy ships went down. As promised, the Mark 14 was a significant improvement in size and punch compared to its predecessor. While weighing roughly 3,400 pounds, it carried a 643-pound TNT warhead. The extra punch promised to finish ships, but planners didn't just pile on explosives. They wanted the blast to occur where it would cause the most structural damage. That logic led straight to a new idea: the Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder. Instead of waiting for contact, the device was meant to detect the distortion in the local magnetic field caused by a ship's ferrous hull and fire beneath the keel. Despite its revolutionary premise, other navies, notably Germany and Britain, were already testing similar magnetic detonators. Paradoxically, Project G53, the Bureau of Ordnance program that produced the Mark 6, was treated as top-secret technology. Manuals explaining its function were written and then locked away in tightly guarded safes, inaccessible to the sailors who would rely on them in battle. If the magnetic exploder was unreliable, the backup was supposed to save the shot. That backup was the contact exploder, a blunt mechanical pistol designed to fire when the torpedo's nose slammed into steel. Depth was managed by a hydrostatic pendulum unit. A hydrostatic valve measured water pressure for absolute depth, while a pendulum sensed pitch, and those inputs drove the control planes. Heading relied on a pre-spun gyro, whose gearing corrected yaw. Each subsystem depended on tight tolerances, clean linkages, steady gyro power, and correct weight balance. Any minor errors could throw a torpedo off depth, off course, or leave it an unexploded hazard. Finding those flaws would have meant blowing up many expensive torpedoes. Unfortunately, the Navy of the interwar years was strapped by the Great Depression. At nearly $10,000 apiece, roughly the price of a new automobile at that time, Washington disliked the idea of blowing one up unless absolutely necessary. As such, tests were limited to exercise heads and dummy warheads made of ballast. They provided data, but not the one thing that mattered most: whether a live warhead would detonate under combat conditions. Knowing the Mark 14 needed testing, Chief of Naval Operations William V. Pratt offered the hull of the O'Brien-class destroyer Erickson as a target, but only on the absurd condition that no live warhead be used, and that the Bureau of Ordnance pay to refloat her if anything went wrong. This was all the more baffling, given that Erickson was already slated for scrapping, leading the Bureau to outright decline any testing at all. Compounding matters, while the Mark 6 appeared to be a breakthrough, it concealed yet another fatal irregularity within its design. Its magnetic trigger was calibrated for narrow test conditions, and often failed when exposed to the varied environments of real oceans. While researching magnetized torpedoes, the Navy trialed its magnetic exploders in waters it had easy access to. This meant the results looked encouraging, but they didn't reflect the wider reality. Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It bends with latitude, twists with local geology, and even shifts with the seasons. A detonator calibrated in one area of the world could be useless in another. Given that, it meant in some seas the Mark 6 wouldn't fire at all. In others, it would trigger the instant it was armed. Because most trials were carried out in equatorial waters, the Bureau tuned the Mark 6's sensitivity to that narrow band of latitude. Tests at Newport, a short series aboard USS Raleigh, and instrumented runs from USS Indianapolis produced thousands of data points that looked convincing, but only within those same conditions. On July 24, 1943, all of these weaknesses would surface in the most public and humiliating way. At this point, and after several complaints, the Navy had finally ordered the Mark 14's unreliable magnetic exploder disabled. The Bureau swore the torpedoes were now battle-ready. North of the Marianas, USS Tenosa stalked the massive 19,000-ton whale factory ship Tonan Maru No. 3, the largest tanker in the Japanese fleet. Commander Dan Daspit couldn't have asked for a better target. Unescorted, fat with fuel, and lying still in the sea. Allied codebreakers had tipped Tenosa onto the tanker's course. Daspit set up what should have been the perfect shot. 4 Mark 14s, launched in a clean spread from ideal range and angle. The crew braced for explosions that never came. Inside, each torpedo struck with a dull metallic thud and bounced off the tanker's hull without detonating. Despot's log was blunt, quote, "Target had been carefully tracked, and with spread used, torpedoes could not have run properly and missed." Frustration boiled, but Despot wasn't done. Through the night, he kept his submarine on the chase, running Tenosa hard until he gained another firing position the next morning. This time, the crew double-checked every Mark 14 in the racks, making absolutely certain the magnetic feature was disabled. The first 2 torpedoes of the second attack had to be fired from a poor angle, but both struck true and exploded. As a result, Tonan Maru's engines went silent, leaving her motionless in the water. The situation every submariner hoped for had arrived. A damaged tanker, broadside exposed, with Tenosa closing in at near point-blank range. Despot fired again. The torpedo ran straight, hit the hull, and failed to detonate. Another followed. Same result. Then another. Each struck the tanker cleanly, and each fizzled into nothing. Shot after shot pounded Tonan Maru without effect. One torpedo even caromed off the port side, veered away, and leapt out of the water like a beaching whale before sinking uselessly astern. By the time he circled to the far side of the target, Despot had fired 9 torpedoes at point-blank range, every one a dud. Worse, a Japanese destroyer was racing in from the east. Despot ordered Tenosa deep, leaving behind a tanker that should not have seen another day. The crew came home both exhausted and furious. In his log, Lieutenant Commander Despot wrote, quote, "I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this." Tenosa had fired 15 Mark 14s, enough to sink any warship afloat, let alone a 19,000-ton civilian tanker. Yet only 2 had exploded. The rest had clanged harmlessly off the hull, gouging dents and poking holes, but leaving the whale factory ship stubbornly afloat. Only 1 torpedo was left. Despot made sure it was brought back untouched. To him, it was proof that the problem wasn't in the crew, but in the weapon itself. Back at Pearl Harbor, the Bureau of Ordnance tore the recovered round apart and declared it, quote, "within spec." Despot stormed into Com Subpack, his face bright red with anger. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood later wrote that he expected Despot to come in cursing everyone, from the Bureau to the base torpedo shop. Instead, Despot was so angry he could barely get the words out. After so many public failures, Tenosa's ordeal could not be brushed aside. Lockwood ordered new tests at Pearl. He had live torpedoes fired into the cliffs of Kahulawe, and warheads dropped from gantries with only the contact pistol armed. Nearly 3/4 of direct 90-degree impacts failed to detonate. Ironically, glancing blows, long dismissed as poor shooting, were more likely to work. The fault lay in the pistol's design. The firing pin had been mounted sideways, 90 degrees off the torpedo's line of travel. On a direct hit, the sudden deceleration pinned it in place instead of driving it forward. By the time the shock eased, the mechanism had already been smashed to pieces against the target's hull. Older Mark 10s had shown similar issues, but the Bureau assumed a stronger spring would fix the problem for the faster Mark 14. A stopgap came from Pearl Harbor's own machinists, who replaced steel parts with lighter aluminum ones, reducing inertia and giving the spring a fighting chance. Later, the Navy finally adopted an electric detonator, triggered by a simple ball switch. Reliable torpedoes had arrived, 21 months into the war. Thousands of wasted torpedoes and missed opportunities had dragged the Navy to this point. At last, the weapon ran true. It held its depth and detonated on impact. In the summer of 1942, USS Grunion took that promise to sea. Her crew trusted the new torpedoes completely. They'd been told the bugs were fixed, the flaws corrected. These were the best weapons the Navy had, tested and proven. When Grunion went into action off the Aleutians, her torpedoes ran straight and fast into the dark. One circled back, slicing through the water toward her. She barely escaped it. A few hours later, she attacked again near Kiska. The crew fired another spread. Then, silence. No more messages came through. It's believed that a second torpedo circled back, and this time she couldn't evade it. Grunion never returned. Even in its repaired state, the Mark 14 carried one last hidden menace, the dreaded circular run. Something deep in its steering system could send the weapon veering into a wide arc, looping back toward the submarine that had fired it. 2 years after Grunion, USS Tullaby was destroyed outright by that same flaw, taking nearly her entire crew with her. problem was eventually traced to the torpedo's gyroscope and its manufacturing tolerances. Fragile components in rough handling and service could cause this mechanism, intended to keep the weapon straight, to jam or drift, sending it into a mortal loop. The Bureau of Ordnance ordered new quality controls, and improved gyros were gradually issued. Crews, meanwhile, adopted stopgap measures of their own, such as altering firing angles, clearing the water ahead, and training sonar operators to listen for the ominous screw of a torpedo gone rogue. By mid-1944, the danger had been contained. The last confirmed loss occurred with Tulipi. Although circular runs continued, they never sank another submarine. Once the Mark 14's flaws were corrected, its effectiveness was undeniable. Armed now with a far more powerful Torpex warhead, 50% stronger than TNT, submarines at last became the scourge they were meant to be. Sinkings finally skyrocketed. The torpedo that had once been a sailor's curse now became his most lethal ally. USS Archerfish proved it in 1944 when she sent the massive carrier Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, plunging beneath the waves after scoring 4 hits. Beyond that, it wasn't long before the Navy had finally achieved its mission of possessing stockpiles of actually useful Mark 14s. Post-war, its best features were folded into the new Mark 16, informed by captured German research. It was a far more advanced weapon, built around a hydrogen peroxide-fueled engine that left no telltale bubble trail and carried a larger, more reliable Torpex warhead. Faster, longer-ranged, and free of the Mark 14's old defects, it represented the submarine torpedo the fleet had wanted all along. And yet, the Mark 14 itself lingered in service until the early 1980s, making it the Navy's longest-serving torpedo. Its endurance owed less to excellence than to practicality, huge wartime stockpiles, constant incremental upgrades, and the Navy's reluctance to discard thousands of still usable weapons. Modernized electronics, improved gyroscopes, and refined warheads kept the design viable through the Korean War and even into the Cold War, long after its flaws were supposed to have been consigned to history. That long service life makes its troubled beginnings even harder to ignore. The Mark 14 remains one of World War II's great what-ifs, a weapon that could have reshaped the Pacific campaign had it worked from the start. Even a modest live fire test in the early 1930s might have spared the fleet its early disasters. With fixes in place before 1941, Japanese shipping losses in the opening year could have been significantly higher, thereby softening enemy logistics even before the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. Submarine attacks against major warships, including attempts on Hiroshima before her final battle off Guadalcanal, might have even scored telling hits. And as Lockwood later remarked, once submarine commanders could finally rely on their weapons to strike home, quote, all major exploder problems suddenly disappeared. It took months of delay and denial before the Bureau of Ordnance accepted the fixes that worked. By then, the cost had been paid in patrols that never returned. The story of those failures became part of the Mark 14's legacy.